Greetings and welcome to the School of Art History's Visiting Artist Series. My thanks to the Visiting Artist Committee, Chad Surhall, and everyone that made tonight possible. My name is Sean Miller, and we are pleased that our speaker tonight is Timothy Morton. His talk is titled Hyperspace. And as I introduced him tonight, I want to start with a brief experiment and hold up this small card. In 2014, Yoko Ono tweeted a suggestion that we all place space transformer cards into certain rooms or next to various objects. So I entered this card into the beginning of the talk in appreciation of Timothy Morton's thoughts, research, and writing. Morton's ideas function as space transformers for his readers, offering new ways of understanding humans, non-humans, and the material world we occupy. Timothy Morton is the Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University. He has collaborated with Bjork, Laurie Anderson, Jennifer Walsh, Haraf Dur Naditur, aka Shoplifter, which is easier for me to say, I apologize, Sabrina Scott, Adam McKay, Jeff Bridges, Justin Guarigla, Leah, and Olafur Eliasson and Farrell Williams. Morton co-wrote and appears in Living in the Future's Past, a 2018 film about collaborating with Jeff Bridges. He's author of libretto for the opera Time, Time, Time by Jennifer Walsh. He is the author of Being Ecological, 2018, Humankind, Solidarity with Non-Human People, Dark Ecology for Logic of Future Coexistence, Nothing, 3 Inquiries into Buddhism, 2015, and Hyperobjects, Philosophy of Ecology at the End of the World, 2013, Realistic Magic, Objects, Ontology, Causality, 2013, The Ecological Thought, 2010, Ecology Without Nature, 2007, and 8 other books and 250 essays on philosophy, ecology, literature, music, art, architecture, design, and food. Morton's work has been translated into 10 languages. In 2014, Morton gave the Welleck Lectures in Theory at University of California, Irvine. After the talk tonight, at the end of the lecture, we should have time for questions, which you can enter into the YouTube comment section throughout this talk, and we'll look for those and include them at the end. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Timothy Morton.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Sean. It's really, really lovely to be doing this. It's an honor. It gives me something to work with. I have terrible anxiety right now, as I'm sure you do, with all the stuff happening in the world. So this lecture is a little bit about how to address that, and it's called Hyperspace. Sometime in the future, human beings figure out how to travel faster than light. Let's call it warp drive. At that point, they realize they don't need money, or rather, they do need socialism. I'm just slightly paraphrasing Star Trek here. They need a whole new economics. Economics is how you organize your enjoyment. They need more enjoyment. They have achieved what William Blake calls an improvement in sensual enjoyment, warp drive. Economics is how you organize your enjoyment, and ecology is the logic of that, how it relates to what is. The logos of the house, the oikos, the way our home fits the earth, the way our words fit with meaning. It can never be perfect. It's more like we're willing to be haunted by the future, creative. That's the trouble with capitalism. It's not creative. They talk about wealth creators, but we all know they're wealth harvesters. They drive combine harvesters. The harvesters are made of algorithms. The algorithms emerge from the factory system, which is automated slavery. This algorithm is an adaptive AI. It machine learns how to extract value. Let's cut to the chase and call it life. It machine learns how to extract life from the biosphere without stopping. There is no break. Socialism is the break. The break is stopping to listen to the quietness that is the future, bisecting the past, the bisecting that we reify as present, but which is in fact a flowing, breathing nowness. We wait here, haunted, until the quiet comes. And Brad, if you could play that video now.
Dream of love and light and laughter. Love lives in my heart. Oh, was it not for us to play with the
That's Khalil Joseph's incredible film for Until the Quiet Comes by Flying Lotus. And I'm going to be talking about it in a minute. The trouble with AI is not the intelligence. Intelligence is always AI, a ghost haunting the machinery. You can never prove that I'm not an android. You can never prove that I'm not an android. You can never prove that I'm not an android. The trouble with AI is the automation. Automation means prolonging the past for the sake of what is now called certainty, predictable profit, predictable growth, predictable planet death. Good to know that will happen in advance, Creativity means uncertainty. It means you might not know whether your plan is right. It means knowing that your plan can never be perfectly right. It will always have a flaw, your economics and your ecology. It will never map Earth perfectly, never one-to-one. How wonderful is that? Acknowledging finitude. To exist is to be flawed, to be wounded and broken. That's what's really good about America, by the way. It doesn't exist yet. Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? I think it would be a very good idea. There is no great to make again. America never was a country. It was a plantation of outsourced European slavery. Right now, we have a wonderfully clear choice: the past or the future. The Mickey Mouse brooms and fear and fascism, or creativity and anxiety and socialism. Sadly and fearfully hovering over the broken piles of Europe with metal detectors, hoping there's a deeper and more constant meaning underneath the whiteness, the bits of swastika, the shards, or being willing to let go and create. More wealth, better distributed, means more creativity. Oscar Wilde's reason for socialism is the best one. This version of creativity isn't creative at all, this one that we think we have now. Individualism is quite the opposite of uniqueness, and as the machinery whirs ever faster, we see how it's all just stereotyping, nothing to do with being an individual even. The economies that the West orientalizes are just the uncanny double of what's happening here already, the ceaseless whir of machines. It's not about us being out of sync with things, if only. Creativity would be truly out of sync, allowing the future to happen. The possibility that things might be different. Ecological economics isn't about getting back in rhythm. That's what we have now, a terrible blasting harmony that shudders everything to powder, a resonant frequency with the biosphere, the glass shattering within the sound wave of the opera singer's voice. It's working very efficiently. Efficiency, when amplified to the proper size, is equivalent to evil. And talking of out of sync, we appear to be losing touch with hyperspace. But the idea will do that to you. This is where if I was talking to you live, I'd say, please laugh now. So maybe I should just say, please just laugh. It'll be nice for you. Hyperspace. The best thing that happened to the collective imaginary in the last few decades. It started with 2001 and Doctor Who. The word existed before, of course it did. I'm trying to get its own entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. Right now it's hidden away somewhere in the entry for the prefix hyper. It's called warp drive. Warp drive. Warping. The thing that the Norns do, entwining the web of fate. The thing that we call weird. The twisting of twine into a loop. The thing Western civilization has been trying to straighten out, Mr. Gandhi, for 12,500 years. The outgoing president's use of warp speed to describe a vaccine invention program is hilarious, stupid, and ugly, because it ignores everything I just said, turning a wonderful meal into a KFC famous bowl that could kill you. That should be playing Pink Floyd's The Great Gig in the Sky while you eat it in abject horror and sadness at 2 a.m., as Patton Oswalt recently put it. Hello, my name's Tim. I love wisdom. Doesn't mean I'm a very good lover, but I realized recently that this is what philosophy means. Right. How stupid is that? I think many boys assume it means having big ideas and then comparing the bigness of your ideas with other boys' big ideas. Having ideas is having ideas. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. At best, ideas are the lampposts you glide past as you drive down the wisdom street. Don't fixate on ideas. Otherwise, you wrap your car around a lamppost. So all this means that I'm very into feelings, especially right now. Feelings are from the future. Ideas are from the past. Feelings are thoughts that you don't quite have words for, not yet. That's why you do therapy, isn't it? The idea, in a way, is just the receipt that comes out of the cash register at the end of the feeling process. So, for example, I wouldn't need to write the book Hyperobjects now. Everyone has the hyperobject feeling. It's called coronavirus. The feeling is much more important than the book. We're going through a very interesting and profound and scary transition point in the world in general and in America in particular. Some of the transition we don't have words for yet. What we have is what Raymond Williams would have called a structure of feeling, a sort of collective vibe or genre of feelings, a horizon of meaningfulness that hasn't yet crystallized into an ideology, a set of ways of inhabiting the world and handling it, thinking about it. Ideology is like statues. The structure of feeling is like Black Lives Matter protesters tearing them down. As a matter of fact, Black Lives Matter and Me Too are wonderful examples of the structure of feeling as opposed to ideology. Structures of feeling are newborn, seemingly fleeting, evanescent, potentially flimsy. That's why they're so powerful, because this ghostly form is exactly how the future appears in our world, as a haunting quality. I'm not saying that we don't know what we're doing when we're protesting against racism, not at all. There's a structure there, but anti-racism is a ghost from the future about how things might be different, might be better. It's flimsy human beings against the entrenched forces of institutional racism in the form of heavily armed police. This flimsiness doesn't mean it isn't powerful, but quite the opposite. It is. People are ready to get hurt and put their lives on the line for this now. I just pulled a show I was starting to make for the BBC because they keep doing this both sides thing on the news and having fascists on and pitching fascist ideas as if they're just another brand of opinion. So I started instead a Patreon podcast, and if you subscribe, the donation goes to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And if you go to Patreon, just put my name in, and it would be an honor to have you as part of this. I don't know quite what this future world looks like, the one I'm very slightly involved in here, but I know something about how it's going to feel. In the working on the ways of being a white guy has put me in a lot of privileged positions over the years, and how on the one or two occasions in the past, when I've mentioned structural racism, I've paid for it in the institutions in which I said it. It's an iconoclastic moment. You know how it's going to feel in the negative. There won't be this, there may not be that. You also know that there will be broader and more equal wealth distribution, whether or not that wealth be money or cultural capital. As they say, race and gender issues are profoundly about wealth. They aren't the candy on top of the socialist project. They are the essence of it, really, because they're about how we coexist more equally and creatively. Just because they showed up afterwards, chronologically, doesn't mean that they're not logically prior. Lots of things are like that. Viruses showed up after bacteria, but viruses tell you something true about life as such. And race and gender struggles are how we're going to make a bridge to the other life forms on this planet. If we don't do that, then we will have skipped a step or 20,000, and we'll be baking white supremacy and patriarchy into ecological political movements. As has happened way too often in the past, and is the reason why people can justifiably say, look at the Nazis, they had animal rights legislation and all that stuff. So there's something sinister about how we've imagined ecological politics. I never did like the tragedy of the commons idea, except and suspected it was deeply on the side of a utilitarianism that was the backbone of how white and male and upper class people kept everyone in check. Lo and behold, the author of that concept was a white supremacist. Of course he was. He had obviously also never actually visited anything like a commons. You can laugh weirdly. So I'm interested in feelings because they're from the future, and I'm interested in structures of feeling because they're from the collective future. And I'm interested, therefore, in how to make them, perceive them, jump into them. They're literally like dimensional gates from the future, which is a theme in Afrofuturist sci-fi. And that's the reason why I played that video, because it's a film about hyperspace, that liquid in which the person is floating, transporting them from the past to the future to the past, haunting the present from the future. The car is the death chariot. The corpse gets up. I swear it seems like the film has been reversed. He's such a brilliant dancer. And we see that boy running in reverse before that moment. It took me ages to figure out that he's actually dancing forwards. Hyperspace is an image for a structure of feeling that is literally a gate to the future, a world of increased enjoyment, which includes more pleasurable coexistence with other life forms, that is more creative and future-oriented than the adaptive AI called capitalism, into whose COVID burning maw we are now literally being told to throw ourselves to keep the furnace going that is burning the planet alive. What's wrong with this picture? I'll take cool and evocative and flimsy and wavering any day over that, a thing John Milton might well have called a new modern bondage of rhyming. Warp drive, the increase in pleasure that gets us there, and the there, which is called hyperspace, How do we get to hyperspace? Well, first we need to find a little bit about what it is. I can't tell you exactly what the future looks like, but I can tell you something about how it will feel and how it will feel when we're on the right track. And that's why I'm writing these days about hyperspace. One big question is, where is it? I think it's in the living room, somewhere between Halloween Town and Christmas Land. I'm deadly serious. But I'm still working on exactly where. And I think the feeling that gets us into the gate is a kind of goth ennui that is in fact the essence of what science feels like. Crazy, yeah? Maybe we'll be able to get to that stuff. But first we need to know some things about this hyperspace stuff. And it is stuff. It has a texture, a warp and a weft. Edmund Husserl's invention of phenomenology is really a fantastic development that has ever so much in common with the idea of space-time, which Einstein discovered roughly around the same time. We'll see that one of the main goals of the things that get us to hyperspace, which I'm calling spacecraft, the imaginary ones anyway, are to allow access to a felt experience of space-time, which the empty void that we still too often assume space to be, but a creamy, lumpy swirl. The medium spacecraft travel within, the scintillating cream we call hyperspace, is in a way just good old outer space, but thought of as a substance, as a thing, an object. If nothing doesn't take the form of a meme-like or tweet-like thing that has a size, shape, vector, point of view, tone, color, or whatever, then why shouldn't space itself be like this? This is a very, very politically progressive idea, as I will go and explain, as well as a very cool thing to think about in itself. It's definitely the reason why I'm kind of getting up in the morning these days, because I'm actually writing a book about it for a kickoff. When I saw Doctor Who's TARDIS for the first time, right, rushing through the space-time tunnel of shiny silver in the mid-70s, like the nacre of a gigantically elongated shell in the shape of a tube worm, I was hooked. Then I saw Star Wars in the cinema at the age of 9. It's at 1977, which for me, for some reason, is still in the future. How do we get there? How do we get to 1977? And my love was confirmed and amplified. So this is a thing, and other people like it too. Spacecraft and hyperspace go together like the proverbial horse and carriage. Spacecraft are the things that get us there in this case being not just any popular old cultural popular image, but a thing with a deep and meaningful structure, a thing based on philosophy and science circa 1900. It's great to catch up. In 1977, I was obsessed with Aliens and Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters, and the lectures of Carl Sagan turned quickly into the book and TV series Cosmos. Soon convinced me that aliens existed and could visit us. If they could, they would need to travel through some kind of hyperspace. I still see 1977 weirdly as the future. Jimmy Carter had just put solar panels on the roof of the White House. Andy Warhol's worm NASA logo from that time kicks the ass of the hamburger of the Reagan years and later. Like hyperspace, the worm is a creamy smooth continuum, like a hip-hop tag, which you're supposed to make without stopping the spray of paint from the spray can. You can easily find it on Google Images. Spacecraft aren't just about mechanical nuts and bolts and know-it-all performances of masculinity. They have everything to do with the spiritual, sensual liquids. That's what spacecraft are really all about. They're about hyperspace, something truly utopian in both senses. We can't reach it technically yet because we can't travel faster than light, so it's a no place, the Greek ou meaning non. But it's also very, very good, the Greek eu, not the disgusting sound that we make in America, but a Greek word meaning good. A quiet, delicious, sparkling cream. Various types of spacecraft can make it into hyperspace, so we think. One of the most significant is what I'm calling in the book the coracle. Another is that very unique vessel, the Millennium Falcon. So one appeal of the spacecraft actually is that it's spiritual. And the coracle is what we're talking about here. What about the spiritual? Not from the point of view of the god, but from the point of view of the mortal. The craft could resemble the coracle of old, in which hermits sailed to holy lands. It's not big enough for a hierarchy. The coracle appears towards the end of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Here it rescues the mariner from his ship, although in the terminology in this book, it's most definitely a craft, as I'm not trying to argue here. The craft is on its last legs from its journey through a netherworld, and it collapses into the ocean, when the coracle of the hermit good touches it. And what a netherworld. When it's going well anyway, in the 5th or 7th parts of this amazing poem, written in 1797, it feels very like the rich, disturbing, beautiful, creamy nacre of Hyperspace. I'm just going to quote a couple of verses here. And soon I heard a roaring wind. It didn't come anear, but with its sound it shook the sails that were so thin and sere. The upper air burst into life, and 100 fire flags sheen. To and fro they were hurried about, and to and fro and in and out the wan stars danced between. You could only really return from such a disturbingly magical place via a coracle. A ship is way too clumsy and liable to invasion and corruption. So there's this distinction, I think, between a craft and a ship. Right? A ship is sort of official and implies a class hierarchy, and a craft is something unofficial that you might borrow or steal or win or just somehow find yourself in one day. The EVA pod, the little spherical vessel in 2001 in which Dave is hurled through hyperspace, is very much one of these coracles. Coracles are famously round. Coracles voyage through spiritual liquid. The small sphere in which Jodie Foster passes through a wormhole in the movie version of Carl Sagan's Contact would be a good example of a coracle, along with the spherical EVA. The fact that both are spheres speaks to their derivation from the practically hemispherical coracle, or not even, just a section of a hemisphere, a minimal bowl that gets tossed by the tides. The coracle is the total opposite of the frigate. This knot of spirituality, sexuality, and science is also related to the psychedelic cultures that have sprung up around the discovery of LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and so on, and in particular, in the ways these percolated through popular culture since the 1960s. Entering hyperspace could also be compared, as it often has been, to a revelatory moment on an acid trip or an MDMA rush, or even the temporary bliss of cocaine. There is a reason why hyperspace is such a popular word in late 70s disco, right? Like the only time the outgoing president ever had real fun, right, which was vicarious enjoyment of black and gay people in Studio 54 without reference to his parents, right, his horrible parents, high on coke. Yeah, that's why it's on the Twitter feed pinned, right? One of my favorite philosophers, Lucia Irigaray, has written on the connection between feminism and mysticism. That's why a strong impulse behind what I'm doing these days is very feminist. There's a long and rich legacy of feminist science fiction, for example. And moreover, there is one definitely dominant way to understand the aesthetics of hyperspace, and that's a feminist one, which I'm going to be arguing in a minute. What about real spacecraft? So, you know, there's the Voyager 1 space probe. And in Star Trek, the motion picture, it becomes a spacecraft, a gigantic one, a coracle gone insane, blown up to contain virtual visions of everything it has encountered. Actually, it's better to say that V'ger, which is what it thinks it is, right? It's Voyager, but it's V'ger, because it's some of the words have been rusted over. Has created around its own strange spiritual realm. All its data turned into a model of space-time itself, a curvilinear cloud with no exit that looks very like the hyperspace that we all kind of visualize hyperspace, right? Only made of blue light. It takes Captain Kirk realizing that it's Voyager 1 and not V'ger to calm it down. It wants to know what it is. It's on a deeply spiritual journey. As a craft carrying Carl Sagan's curated humanity data into the cosmos, it truly is a coracle for us in this respect. What Sagan was able to do with its photograph of Earth, the pale blue dot, speaks to this. Just as it left the solar system, Sagan had the probe turn around and take the last possible picture of Earth, the last because it's just 1 pixel large. Then he improvises extempore on the tininess and pettiness of human aggression amidst the cosmic wonder, what Milton called aptly a wilderness of harmony. We think of outer space as an empty container. It isn't. It's a rippling ocean of space-time. That's the most accurate description we have, starting with the relativity equations of Albert Einstein. The empty container idea is from Isaac Newton, and it's several hundred years out of date. It's not surprising that this idea has persisted. It doesn't seem to matter very much at human scales that we move around in a sort of liquid emanated by physical objects. In the background of this common thought is the way humans have confused space and time with the measurement of space and time for thousands of years. One might even go so far as saying that one of the foundational moments of civilization, the agricultural sort that started around 10,000 BCE, is exactly this confusion of space and time with their measurement. We think of time as minutes and seconds and years, but those are just measuring categories. We think of space as meters and miles, but those are also just measuring points. This is exactly the same thing as confusing logic with logistics. To get stuff done, you need an underlying logic about why and how stuff gets done. We don't confuse heat and temperature. We know heat is a kind of radiance. We can feel it when we hold a hot cup of coffee. We don't confuse that feeling with what we see on a thermometer we dip in the coffee. We don't seem to know emotionally that space and time are actually feelings or feels. In general, we think of space as this empty container thing, and a three-dimensional map with invisible lines on it. For example, the distance between your face and the screen is, you probably imagine, an empty space that is filled with things such as dust particles and light rays, but this isn't true either. Science fiction imagines spacecraft that can travel faster than light. When they do, they enter this realm that we're calling hyperspace. And what's fascinating about hyperspace is that it's definitely not an empty box. You would have thought that the hyper in the word meant that whatever space is, hyper is a lot more of it, or bigger than it, just a bigger empty box. But it turns out that hyperspace is an idea that allows us to feel space. In a way, hyperspace is space feel, just as like potato chips have mouthfeel in the PR business. The word mouthfeel has really bad mouthfeel, by the way. You can laugh at that one too if you want. But there is a much simpler way of putting it. Hyperspace is a place. Not only that, it's a really nice place. And Chad, if we could have the image now. This is the cover of my book. I just love it so much. I just want you to see this cover. I think it's coming out in the middle of next year. There you go. Yeah, if we could keep that up, that would be great, because it's kind of a good reference, but maybe we can zoom to me in a minute. So really, it shouldn't be called hyperspace. It should be called hyperplace. This is a truly remarkable idea. You know, like it's a thing, right? It's not just an idea, it's an idea thing, right? It's a tweet, it's a meme. It's however you want to imagine an idea. It's not just floating around in a vacuum. It means human beings are capable of rising above, hyper means above in Greek, the idea that space is a blank neutral container. And this means that humans in general can come into sync with the developments in philosophy and physics that rocked the world around 1900. These developments are the discovery of spacetime by Einstein and the discovery of phenomenology by Husserl. What do I mean? Well, one simple conclusion is that ordinary people realize in a visceral and experiential way that we're not living in the Middle Ages anymore. And that's great, but what do I mean in greater depth? I think space-time, general relativity theory, and phenomenology might be very much the same kinds of development, and I think you can tell because of the art in the period. Only consider the water lilies paintings of Claude Monet, most vividly and accurately displayed in the Orangerie in Paris. The Orangerie is a pair of oval-shaped rooms in the Jardin des Tuileries. It was interesting to choose an oval. An oval is a circle that's been squeezed, just like space-time isn't totally regular, but squeezed and stretched. And sort of what I like about that image is that it's got its own kind of squeeziness to it. It's called gravity. An oval is also an egg, an obvious container that isn't just a container, but a living one, a habitat for an embryo. The visitors, as it were, are the embryo. And Monet's paintings are the yolk, a gorgeous mauve green blue yolk. Floating in the yolk are little blobs that are the water lilies in question, but they appear not as objects in empty space, but as an intrinsic part of their habitat, the slowly rippling, smooth, transparent liquid of Monet's pond at Giverny. The pond contains so much else that the paintings depict: water, weeds, shadows, the sky. The way Monet paints them, it's as if the lilies emerge out of this medium. They don't just sit on it or in it. It's as if they're symptoms of the water itself growing out of the mauve or blue or green liquid. This is just like how Einstein imagined space-time. It's also just like how some experimental novelists imagine prose. When I teach my How to Read Literature classes, I always start with the idea that prose is really poetry with really, really long lines that have to be right justified and called paragraphs. Nowadays, anyway. It seems easy and helpful to do so, but at some point there's a flip. When I determine the students are ready for it, and instead of teaching prose as really long poetry, I teach prose as the overall medium which sometimes can become hotter or more lumpy or reified as poems. On this view, poems are like little islands or planets or water lilies in a more general liquid like a pond or space-time. Prose is the basic stuff, water is the basic stuff, space-time is the basic stuff, hyperspace is the basic stuff, hyper no longer in the sense of beyond, but in the sense of concentrated or condensed, like condensed milk or consommé. Consider also the idea of the quantum ground state and the quantum field. The quantum theory also emerged right around 1900. And while it seems not to fit well with the theory of space-time, it shows some very key aesthetic characteristics. In a way, prose is the ground state of writing. And when you accelerate it by adding some energy, you get poetry. Hyperspace is in a way a regular old space, but imagined as a phenomenon along the lines of Husserl, as a thing with specific characteristics, not just a blank slate. And this is terribly important because space is supposed to be what contains all the other phenomena. If space itself isn't different from other phenomena, such as planets and people, listening to a funny lecture by Tim Morton, it means that it's not omnipresent, and that omniscience and omnipotence are therefore impossible. It's not evenly always the same. It has contours, it's creamy. The way hyperspace is visualized as a kind of roaring blue and white cream is a wonderful sign of real political, intellectual, and artistic progress. The creamy phenomenology of hyperspace means that space is palpable, not different from galaxies and GNUs. It means that the whole of the universe is one thing, the same as its parts, black holes and boots, so that the whole is amazingly less than the sum of its parts. It's not a scary infinite mouth at all. It's not swallowing everything and being ontologically bigger than everything. It's just a creamy swirl with blobs in it called quasars and cockatoos. In a way, hyperspace is the ecological niche of the spacecraft, its habitat. They conjure it up, but only because it's independent of them, like having an idea if you're a phenomenologist. You see, this is what Husserl proved, that ideas are mind independent. We can talk about that later if you want. It's a little technical, but I can prove it. A logical proposition is true whether or not you are thinking it. Hyperspace is there whether or not you make it. Then the spacecraft enters hyperspace very suddenly, like a marble plopped into a perfectly marble-shaped hole. If the spacecraft is the baby, then hyperspace is the milky bathwater. They go together like a terrapin and mangrove thicket. And just like that mangrove thicket, hyperspace isn't empty and dark and cold. It's warm and creamy and luminous. The term hyperspace was first coined in 1867. 30 years later, the term had evolved to suggest the two essential ingredients of the geometry of the luminous ambient cream that we're talking about. First, hyperspace can refer to any space of more than 3 dimensions. Space-time is 4-dimensional since time is treated as a 4th dimension. Secondly, hyperspace can refer to non-Euclidean space. The geometrist Gauss had figured out how to create an entirely new geometry based on curved surfaces. If you draw 2 parallel lines on a piece of paper, they will never meet. They will meet at infinity, as the Euclidean saying goes. If, however, you take a felt tip pen and draw 2 parallel lines on an orange, they will eventually meet at the navel. This is Gaussian geometry. It was pivotal in Einstein's description of space-time. To get the notion of squishy, rounded space-time across, his text charmingly refers to reference mollusks as if space-time were made of mussels and oysters. The aliveness and wetness of these images is something we shall be constantly, I think, thinking about as we explore the notion of hyperspace. Space-time isn't like Newtonian space at all, frigid and dry. Space-time, and in particular hyperspace, is damp. And in the case of hyperspace, it's luminous and glistening. So we can probably just go to me now and forget this color. That's all right. Thank you. Hyperspace or warp drive has been some kind of tunnel since the days of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Doctor Who. Stanley Kubrick lived in the UK and must have seen the way the opening credits evolved to pay homage to his 2001 Stargate. What is the basic phenomenology of traveling down a tunnel? It's a form of moving while being still. The end of the tunnel grows larger but doesn't arrive. At a distance, it might grow very slowly from what appears to be a small point, the light at the end of it. Many people who've had near-death experiences or who have taken DMT or studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead report about this tunnel. And the tunnel has its own reality. It's not just a dark, empty tunnel. It's luminous and flowing, as in the case of the mid-1970s Doctor Who tunnel. It appears to be infinitely ribbed, infinitesimally ribbed. But it's really the hyperspace of Star Wars that is a fully, sensually realized time liquid a liquid that has progressively influenced the opening credits of the Doctor Who reboots since 2005. It has nothing to do with the after-death Bardo space that is evoked in 2001. It's more like that Doctor Who. It's trippy, but it's not very mental or conceptual or psychological. It has a physical feel to it. It has its own, and it has its own reality. You suddenly enter when you pull back on a certain throttle on the control panel of the Millennium Falcon. We all know this, right? The stars ahead begin to stream light as if points are turning into lines. Then all of a sudden, zoom, there you are. The effect is of an arrow being shot into a target or a slingshot being released, some kind of spring-loaded orgasmic recoil, something like a horse being whipped and charging forwards. The Star Trek reboots also feature this springy effect. What happens is well described by the feminist word seclusion. We often think of spacecraft, for obvious patriarchal reasons, as phallic symbols penetrating the hyperspace tunnel. But it's more accurate and less violent to think of it the other way around. Binney Adamjak developed the very helpful verb seclude and the noun seclusion to describe any process of enveloping, a hand around a sex toy or an anus around a finger, for example, or a mouth around a nipple. Here's a salient paragraph from her essay about it. Think of the moment when you were taught in school how to prevent the spread of sexually transmitted infections. No one would ever think of trying to push the banana into the freshly unwrapped condom, would they? But the task of correctly applying a condom is easy when you think of it as unrolling the tube onto the banana. Indeed, seclusion is an extremely common experience of everyday life. Think of how a net catches fish, how gums envelop their food, how a nutcracker crunches nuts, or how a hand encircles a joystick, a bottle of beer. This gets us out of the habit of associating penetration with certain parts of the body and with a certain kind of violence. Hyperspace secludes the spacecraft. The roaring, wheezing sound of the TARDIS as the Doctor enters hyperspace is something like the grinding churn of air or fluids surrounding the craft and entering into some kind of friction with it. Indeed, at one point, the Doctor is told by his female pilot, who becomes his wife at some point, that he's basically leaving the parking brake on and that the ride through hyperspace could be much more silent and well lubricated. Hyperspace secludes the craft because at light speed or faster, in a sense, that craft isn't traveling at all. This Einsteinian factoid is suggested by the engineer Scotty in the first Star Trek reboot, when a very old Mr. Spock types out his equation for transwarp beaming, teleportation at speeds faster than light. And he says, Simon Pegg, imagine that. It never occurred to me to think of space as a thing that was moving. It's why I very much like this picture that I showed you of hyperspace on the cover of that book. It's its own thing. It's a place that is approaching the ship almost rather than the other way around. There's a tension between the supposed reality of Cartesian and most definitely patriarchal and also colonial space that the ship sort of thinks it's traveling through and the hyperspace that's about to envelop it. That sort of Cartesian illusion is about to collapse. We're moving from a regime of penetration to one of seclusion. In the Star Trek reboots, the spring-like recoil is definitely as if space itself was sucking the ships into it, secluding them in its warp, a word that most definitely suggests the feminized activity of weaving and its soft, winding, twisting fabrics, rather than the straight and narrow grids of Cartesian space. In the Star Wars series, when we see a ship or craft enter hyperspace from the outside, they disappear, exactly as if they've been enveloped by a thick medium that makes them invisible. The evocation is of something beyond speed, a speed beyond speed itself, as if we were experiencing velocity as such, rather than a specific one. It's like what Immanuel Kant says about the sublime. The sublime gives you a feeling of magnitude beyond any specific number or amount. Try counting up to infinity. You don't teach my class. I go, okay, everybody, count up to infinity now. 3, 2, 1, go. 99999999999. Did you get there? 999999999. You never get there, and then suddenly you realize, whoa, that is infinity, a number I can't get to. It's not a series of nines going on forever. It's uncountable. It's some kind of number, but you don't know what. Infinity is what my favorite philosophy called OOO calls the withdrawal aspect of a thing. I call it the underworld nowadays. I like this word. It's the underworld. You can literally hold the underworld in the palm of your hand, as in the Blake poem. It is the palm of your hand. Infinity means there might be 3 or whatever of whatever that is, but You can't know yet, right? This not yet quality, this futural open quality is exactly what we're experiencing in the sublime. And if OOO is correct, it's a basic feature of every entity in the universe, from spoons to Grand Moff Tarkin. Everything is a TARDIS. Everything is bigger on the inside, infinitely bigger, right? So hyperspace is part of the structure of how things are. That's a thing that I said in my book, Hyperobjects, and come to think of it, the hyperspace of Star Wars in particular is a wonderful example of a hyperobject. Something so massively distributed in time and space, it just sort of is time and space, everywhere and every when, all at once, that you can't point to it. It's invisible because it's everywhere. And that's like the future. The future is everywhere. You can reach it any time. The real actual future, as I sometimes like to say, is the future future. Futurality, the possibility that things could be different. It's like what Blake says, again, about the seeing eternity in a flower, or how Walter Benjamin talks about how each moment could be a gate into utopia. It's not visible, but you can feel it. The hyperspace of Star Wars is the closest a regular cinema goer gets to realizing that film isn't just about the visible, it's about the invisible. And in particular, the feel of motion, all that liquid celluloid spooling through a projector, right? So Star Wars is, we all know, shot in luxurious 70mm. It's a lovely gift that George Lucas gave to ordinary people, something utopian to keep them going. It's nowhere, utopia, not place, and it's good, Greek utopia, good place, as I was saying a few minutes ago. Hyperspace in Star Wars is a comfy lounge, a place where you can let your hair down, right? Like we all know the basic phenomenology of the Millennium Falcon, right? You have to walk backwards up a slope, firing a gun to repel the enemy. Then you get into a leatherette swivel chair and you have to learn how to sit in a leatherette swivel chair. Then at some point you get into hyperspace and it's like coming home from work. It's about leisure time, right? You come into your living room, you can relax. It goes really quiet. You can make sexy chit chat with people. You can play chess with Chewbacca. It's nice in there. I profoundly disagree with the popular left cynicism and despair that ideology is everywhere and that my telling you how paralyzed and trapped we are indicates how much more intelligent I am than you. I believe that the ideology is everywhere ideology is wrong for the right reasons. It's true, but it misses something crucial. Ideology may be everywhere, but it's not everything. Another way of saying this is that the past is everywhere. Just look at the wreckage around you we call the present moment. Everything is a story about how something happened to something. My face is a map of all the acne I had when I was 19 years old. But who is this Tim Morton guy anyway? What exactly is a face? What does this poem, which represents hundreds of deliberate and non-deliberate decisions made to put a rhyme here and an image there, what does this poem mean? What is this building? We can see how it was made by looking at it and walking around it, but what is it really? The window isn't just for someone to look through, it's also a landing strip for dust and flies. So what is it? What it is, as opposed to what it's for, is this underworld. That's what we're seeing when we enter hyperspace. We're sort of impossibly seeing this underworld. We're seeing outside of Plato's cinema cave, and we're all seeing it, or rather feeling it, in the basic twisting turn, like trying to see something out of the corner of your eye. When you look directly, it's gone. So fascism believes that we've been alienated from a great past that we could somehow find underneath the scraps and fragments of the present. I think that socialism or communism believes that we've been alienated from the future. We don't say it much. We often say that the idea of alienation implies some kind of authentic, aka past state from which we've been excluded, but this is just religion. It's right, we are alienated, but for the wrong reasons. We aren't alienated from the past. Once you get used to it, the idea that we've been alienated from the future is actually much easier than thinking about some kind of fall. How could a fall have happened if everything was perfect? And just look around you. If you can see stuff that isn't quite right, it means that the past sucked. It couldn't have been perfect. The past is just all the crumbs of the cookies that crumbled so far. But all the mountain of cookie crumbs in the world doesn't imply that there isn't cookie dough ice cream. The sophisticated ideology is everywhere theory, a sort of thing someone like me is supposed to teach you in something like theory class, is wrong for the right reasons. The crude we are alienated from a natural state theory is right for the wrong reasons. We are alienated from the future, which is strictly invisible and unspeakable, if you try to point to it with a spotlight, but not unfeelable. That's the other thing about hyperspace, talking of spotlight, is if there's nothing to focus on the cinema screen, it's just this flood of light. We're illuminated by the cinema screen itself, which has become a floodlight. It's a very interesting moment in the Star Wars films when that happens. Suddenly everyone gets to enjoy a Bridget Riley painting, no matter whether they know who Bridget Riley is or not. I'm very interested and keen on talking about these sort of huge popular things that no one wants to talk about because they think they're gross. The past may be everywhere, but it's not everything. Things could always be different. Everything has a zoom or whoosh quality. To this extent, it is really perfectly possible to see the future. Telekinesis, a powerful feature of the Force of Star Wars, implies how things can travel faster than light. And that's the other thing about Star Wars. It's like, we spend billions of dollars making and watching films about telekinesis, right? And what is that saying? Given that actually telekinesis is a much more logical description of how causality happens than mechanical motion, as quantum theory keeps trying to tell us in a very simple way. It's not woo-woo or complicated. I can move this glass over there without walking over and grabbing it. I can move it as soon as I want. That's telekinesis. In other words, I can move it faster than light. The falcon making hyperspace, which is faster than light, is the truly utopian version of the energy substance that the religiosity of the Jedi hides and turns into an invaluable commodity, creating class division, like how Tibetan society recognizes reincarnated lamas in the ordinary folk, right? Like, this is the original sin of Star Wars, I think. The Force is this totally non-theistic energy, and the dark side is just a slightly higher amplitude version of it, which is why Rey can shoot this Force lightning out of her finger. But the Jedi have decided to make this binary, right, between the dark and the light, and they've created this hierarchy, and they're so busy maintaining it that they don't notice stuff. It's why, weirdly, the Sith look more spiritual. They've got this fantastic gear. It looks clearly more cool, more like your idea of a yogi. The Falcon isn't a human. The Falcon isn't really a person. It's not even a droid. Yeah, no wonder that for everyone, the Falcon just is Star Wars, right? Like, beyond and above the Jedi, I think the Falcon is the real hero there of Star Wars. And it can so easily be detached from the Star Wars films so readily that it has its own reality and that anyone can access it, right? You don't need to be a sacred llama to make hyperspace. You just need to know how to flip some controls. And that's the end of my lecture. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you, Timothy. Everybody, like, if you have questions, put them into the comments now. There's been a lively bunch of comments going on throughout the talk, and so, but not necessarily in the form of questions, just great comments. So please throw some questions in there, and I'll start off with the first one. And somebody should ask about ideas being mind independent, but I'm not going to ask that question. My question is more about 1977 is the future. And I was curious about, in Hyperobjects, you reference the work of Lamont Young and being ecological features. This is not here by Yoko Ono. And I was thinking about like when I first learned about it, I think my ideas about it were informed by Joseph Boy's energy plan for the Western man and his ideas about energy transference, which I suppose is neither here nor there. But I'm curious if you could discuss these artists and why intermedia art, Fluxus, and conceptual art are helpful in discussing climate change and other things.
Gosh, that's wonderful and enormous, and I don't think I can do all of it, but I can do 1977. I had, in many ways, a really terrible childhood, and the 70s had some terrible, terrible stuff going on it, especially if you were a kid. So don't get me wrong, I don't want to go back there. But there was something about 1977 that showed me this utopia. My grandfather was a patent barrister. He came out from America with these leatherette swivel chairs, and then I saw them in Star Wars. And like I say, I had the feeling of living in an almost socialist economy, which we don't have now. Ordinary people in America don't know what this feels like, which is why they vote the way they do, I think. They don't know. The wealth income distribution in America used to be way better than it is in Norway now. No one remembers that. But in the 60s, up until then, It was way better than it is in Norway now. Think about that. You know, so I grew up in England. There were 2 deliveries of mail a day. There was milk on your doorstep. You know, there was a nice functioning public transportation, you know. So I have a feeling inside about what that is, you know, and I'm sort of in my work constantly trying to give people the feeling without using the words. Because if you use the words, people get weirdly allergic and they sort of get pissed off and have all these ideas about it. So it's much better just to do the feeling. And feelings are better anyway.
Great. Craig Smith has this question. Can you expand on Kubrick, Danny's Apollo 11 sweater in the Overlook Hotel?
Gosh. The thing about being me is that I'm an stunningly ignorant person. There are so many things I don't know, and I bet you know, Craig, there's more than I do, even though I have seen The Shining so many times. I can definitely talk about the sort of feeling of hyperspace in 2001, which is that it's basically Versailles. You know, it's a very undemocratic kind of hyperspace. It's protected by the paranoid military. 2001 is actually one of the funniest, darkest comedies ever made. The clue is that it's got the military in it. When Kubrick has the military in his films, you know, it's going to be a funny one. And, you know, the audience is reduced to wanting something to come out of that horizontal version of the monolith called a cinema screen. You know, and there's a prelude and an intermission, and you're just kind of sitting there going, get on with it. Everyone's been reduced to the status of Dave in, you know, in the pod there, going, open the pod bay doors, please, Al. It's an incredible frustration and almost panic. So perhaps I will have a thought about The Shining in a few minutes, but right now I don't have a thought about it. As beautiful and as horrifying as that is. So Ashley's asking, there seems to be a recurrent interest in the texture of abstract concepts, the viscosity of hyperspace cream. Yeah. Well, that's the Husserl thing, you see. Husserl showed us that ideas don't just float around in a void. Ideas just are like memes or tweets, right? They all have a way of having them. You know, like, if I say welfare, it implies a whole bunch of very condescending politics, power relationship, right? In Britain, up until 2010, when the Conservatives took over, they called it social security, which is what we call, what the Conservatives think of as the thing they mustn't destroy over here, right? There's a whole different feeling. There's a whole different way of having that idea. Just like there's a whole way of holding a tennis racket, or there's a whole way of pouring the wine so it tastes good or whatever, right? Like everything's like that. And thoughts aren't just symptoms of your brain. They are actually independent of your brain, you see. And you can kind of prove it by saying, well, if thoughts are just symptoms of your brain, then, well, what is a brain? Well, it's a thing you can prove by using all kinds of science. And how do you prove the science? Well, it's backed up by logic. And what is logic? Well, it's a symptom of a healthy brain. And what's a brain? Well, it's a thing that you can prove by science, and you can prove the science by logic. And what's logic? It's a symptom of a healthy brain. And what's a healthy brain? Well, it's a thing that you can... And so you have this infinite regress. And from there, Husserl's like, well, that can't be true because it's just an infinite regress. So thoughts, logical propositions, he says, like, if P and if P, then Q, are independent of whoever's thinking them. Then he's like, oh, hating and loving and wishing and everything is like that, right? And Millennium Falcon's a good example. You can think it outside of the film. You can just like have the idea. You can have a Lego model of it, right? We all sort of intuitively know, right? And yeah, it's a feeling, right? It's a feeling. Ideas are really just reified versions of feelings. The feeling is better, right? Like, for example, New York City, right? As soon as I say that, you're visualizing. I don't have to say, first there's Fifth Avenue, then there's Sixth Avenue, then you get to Alphabet City, and then there's the Statue of Liberty there and the Central Park. You don't build it up from little pixels. It's just there, right? It's an emotion. New York is New York, what a wonderful time. It's a feeling, right? And could be different for different people, but it's got all kinds of similar commonalities in it, right? So in that way, the future is a feeling too, right? The future is not like some objectified thing that's over there. It's like this kind of shadow bisecting what we call now you know, which is in fact just this kind of weird relative motion between the past and the future. Like it's a feeling, right? Like we're constantly trying to delete that, right? We think meditation, for example, is about getting rid of this funny, anxious, queasy relative motion feeling. Oh my God, everything's flowing all the time, and what's going to happen next? But that's the gold, you know? That's why the corporate mindfulness stuff is really bad for you. Don't do it, especially now if you're feeling stressed, because it turns you not into a pod person who's just hypnotized, like Zizek thinks, but actually into a kind of maniacal filler out of evaluation forms about yourself every 5 minutes. And that's not really meditation. That's like driving a car in order to be really good at using the stick shift or the steering wheel. And of course, there are quite a lot of boys who like to do that. But really the point of driving a car is to get somewhere and look out of the window and enjoy the feeling, you see. And so, yeah, like feelings and ideas, they're kind of like they're made of the same thing, yeah. And ideas are really just like it was that's the feeling that I'm having, right? Like, first of all, hyperobject was an emotion. It was like, oh my God, the future, you know, and what we do to Earth and the things that persist even after we've thrown them away. And what about all the styrofoam in the world? Like, wow, imagine that. Like there's got to be a word for that. And it's slowly for a few minutes, like hyper object. But it's the feeling, right? So in using the word, I'm trying to give you the feeling. Yeah. How does automated agricultural programming systems travel through space? Or does it? Gosh, I don't know. I'm not agricultural person. I may be automated, but I'm not very agricultural. And I never travel through space. I've never traveled through hyperspace. So I don't know the answer to that question. That's too technical for me. That's I need to be better at physics. With the assumption that the modes of thinking that you describe being more conducive to a reduction of suffering for all beings, how do you go about convincing people? That's a very good. Okay, so I'm writing this memoir and it's called Electric Peanuts for some strange reason. And the last chapter is called The Chicken. And it's about all these different objects. When I say object, I mean something very neutral. I just mean like entity. I don't mean like something that's hard and rigid as opposed to me, who's a subject. There's a horrible master-slave duality in the way we think about subjects and objects all the time. And I'm trying to change it, yeah? So, you know, there's an object called the chicken. That's the last chapter. So there's a joke, right? There's this guy who's paranoid he's being persecuted by a giant chicken. And he goes to the mental asylum and he gets cured and he's so relieved, and he comes rushing back a few weeks later and he goes, oh my God, oh my God. And the head psychiatrist is like, what's the matter? And he's like, oh, the chicken. And the head psychiatrist is like, yeah, but you know the chicken doesn't exist. He's like, yeah, but try telling that to the chicken. So when I write stuff, I'm trying to talk to the chicken, yeah? I'm talking to your, I'll never say the word unconscious in public because it's very dangerous. So I'll say it for you. And don't worry, it's not about you. It's about all those other people who aren't watching this. We, in this bubble of self-consciousness, are purely transparent to ourselves and have nothing to worry about. So don't worry. So like talking to the reader, but also trying to work with the unconscious mind. That's the thing about America that I really learned in this election, actually, fully and properly, is that America is the id of Europe. It's like the unconscious of you. It's like trying to convince people here. It's like trying to talk to people in a dream. You can't do it. You got to do something else, right? You've got to do something weird and trippy and slightly miraculous to get people to click, right? But that's also the good thing, because it means that intrinsically people aren't going to lock onto these awful ideas and actually become Nazi Germany. That actually they're more, we are all, and I'm American, can you tell from my accent? We're all basically Harpo Marx, right? We're basically this weird, slightly disturbing, inconsistent, smiling guy who's like, just like lifting up bits of paper going, what is this weird column? I don't understand. What in Europe, I'm supposed to like pizza? What is it? I don't know. You know, that's kind of where we're at. We've got all these piles of Europe lying around. I think it should say that on the dollar bill, you know, instead of a pluribus unum, it should say the greatest pile of Europe ever in capital letters. Oh yeah, thank you, Anna. Thoughts on Elon Musk and space? I'm not going to Mars. I want to go to Earth. Have you ever heard of this? It sounds amazing. How about we try landing on Earth first?
Okay, thank you so much, Tim. That was amazing. And I wanted to also just tell everybody that tomorrow we have 2 seminars lined up at 1 and 2 o'clock, where the grad students will be meeting and prepare. I know that tonight probably generated some great questions for tomorrow. It was an amazing evening. Thank you so much.
It's been an honor and a pleasure, Sean. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.